All right, welcome to the Airiam Podcast. This podcast covers topics related to cyber and human resilience. It's geared towards owners and CEOs of small to medium-sized companies, as well as IT and cybersecurity leaders. My name is Bill Bowman, and I'm the Director of Marketing here at Airiam. Our guest today is Jim Aldridge. Jim is a practical risk management professional and the Vice President for Partnerships at MOXFIVE. He's been in cybersecurity for over 20 years, and that includes 6 years at Mandiant as a Director Incident Response. MOXFIVE is a specialized technical advisory firm founded to bring clarity to the complexity of cyber attacks. So, Jim, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing excellent, Bill. Happy to be here.
Great. Thank you for joining us. The co-host today is, again, Art Ocain. Art is the field CISO and CIO at Airiam. How are you doing this morning? I'm recording a little earlier than normal for you, I think. So you definitely...
Yeah. I've had a busy night. So, I'm caffeinating as we go. I think the hamsters are starting to work in unison, and the brain cells are starting to actually align, so we might be able to speak this morning.
They're starting to click, starting to fire the pistons. So That's great to have you again, Art, as well. So our topic for today will be your flight plan for ransomware recovery. Now, Jim is not only a cyber risk professional, but he's also a private pilot. And we noticed that he shared some comparisons between cyber disaster preparation and recovery and aviation preparedness on his social media account. So we wanted to invite him on to discuss those topics today. And before we dive into the topic of your flight plan for ransomware recovery, we'd like to get to know our guests a little bit better with the same question we ask each one that comes on, and that is, how do you start your day? It's early right now for us, but how do you start your day usually to make the most of it and get the brain cells going, Jim?
So Bill, I started off with a very strong cup of coffee. So I like the press for that high viscosity brew. Just get centered for the day. Try and not do the devices right immediately when I get up. If I can manage it, get centered, and then check for anything urgent, head into the office and get started on the day.
How do you do that? I always check my device first thing. What do you got to do something else? Maybe brush your teeth and stuff. I guess that's
a quick check, but try not to get enmeshed in it until I've had that first cup of coffee.
Take some deep breaths and some stuff like that before going. So, Jim, you've been in cybersecurity for decades. What made you want to get into cybersecurity and IT and cyber risk management? In your career.
So thinking back on it, in my childhood, I always had a computer around the house ever since I could remember, even back to the TRS-80 with the cassette tape drive, loading up programs. Then the Commodore 64, finally got a PC with, I remember the 20 megabyte hard drive that was like the size of a shoebox. Started to get into bulletin board systems back in the day with dial-up, for those that remember. Just really got into that, taught myself some programming languages, middle school, high school, and one of my first experiences with security was my computer science teacher in high school had just installed a Novell NetWare lab, and so World Wide Web was just becoming widely available at that time. And I remember punching into Lyco search engine, hacking Novell, and just my eyes open to the ecosystem, to the ways that things could be subverted. And so that really got me started in security.
Nice. Yeah, I remember the Lycos, you had the Alta Vista, you had the Ask Jeeves, whatever happened to them, but maybe they'll make a comeback one of these days, maybe. So that's cybersecurity. That's been your career. Then aviation, is that kind of started as a hobby? What made you, get into aviation, get into flying, and where did that drive and that motivation come from?
So similar to how I got into security, I've just always been interested in planes back as far as I could remember. Had a flight simulator back on that Commodore 64. It was a 747 simulator. I never did figure out how to fly it. It was ASCII art, and it's always basically ended with me trying to cursor up and then just crashed. It says telling me I had crashed. Had Microsoft Flight Simulator back in the day. My dad took me to air shows. Of course, like so many folks, and I guess it was the late 80s, influenced by Top Gun, kind of wanted to, that looks so exciting. And then really got into it in earnest around 10 years ago. I was having lunch with a client who had just gotten his pilot's license. He kept talking about lunch, and started looking into it to find a flight school to get started on it. And just took it from there, got into the training, and then continued with it past when I got my certificate.
Awesome. What flight school did you go to? You're in Virginia area, or?
I'm in New York City now.
New York area.
I was in Northern Virginia. Did my training at a shop called Aviation Adventures out in Leesburg. Would highly recommend it. It was great school.
Nice. So, IT, aviation, seemingly two different fields, or they are two different industries. But what are the similarities that you found between flying and aviation and your work every day in the IT and risk industry?
So thinking about that question, there's really three key dimensions where I see a lot of commonalities, and those are complexity inherent in aviation, as well as the IT systems that we operate, and factoring into attacks and ransomware recovery. Second are the unknown factors in both of those systems, and third is the need for risk management. So never taking away or eliminating a risk, but just being cognizant of it and mitigating it to a level that's acceptable. So I think that's what it's all about, both in aviation as well as in IT.
Yeah, so I guess in order to fly a plane to get from one place to another, there's always going to be a level of risk. In order to try new technology or make the most of modern technology, there's always gonna be a little risk. So it's like you said, it's the management of it, not the elimination of it, that is important.
Yeah, it's like understanding the risk is the key part there. I think that when I think about aviation, I think of the amount of systems involved, the amount of you mentioned it with complexity, but just that there's a whole system of things that have to work together in unison. And in cybersecurity, although human life may not be at stake as often, but you're also looking at it with a systems view. And that's great to bring those correlations.
I think it's also kind of building on that. It's another similarity, and sometimes folks get tired of hearing this because it's a mantra across cybersecurity that I've been hearing since the beginning of my career, which is the people, process, technology. It's really the same thing when you look at aviation too. And you have, in any flight, you have people factors. So you have your own factors as a pilot. Are you getting enough sleep? Are you under undue stress? Did you eat a good breakfast? Where in IT as well, understanding how do teams work together. If there is an incident, is there an understanding of what the procedures are and who is going to do what? So a lot of similarities.
Yeah, the teamwork part of it, and talking about that teamwork and that collaboration. So Airiam and MOXFIVE, we're partners on different engagements for incident response. Before we dive into the flight plan for ransomware recovery, can you, Art and Jim, also, of course, can you talk a little bit about how collaboration comes into play for incident response engagements when the times are stressful, and what steps are taken to help out the company impacted or organization impacted?
Well, there's definitely a process involved, but I'd say the best thing about having a partnership like we have is that we can trust each other with that process, and that we've worked together for so long that we can move in unison and kind of work together as a unit in order to solve the client's problem when they're having the worst day or week of their life. That ability as partners, I think, is kind of a unique thing that Mox brings to the table when it comes to incident response, is the fact that partner ecosystem they've created can act so unified and can solve problems so directly and without causing a lot of the disconnection that you feel a lot of times when you're working with different companies. So that is is really I think the super value add that I see from the partner side that Mox is bringing to the table there, and that helps people recover. But I know Jim can run through kind of what the process looks like.
Yeah, totally agree, Art, with where you're, where you took that. One of the most important things is that the level of trust and the repetition that we built up from a process perspective, thinking back towards the overall theme. Our process is, we first want to understand the client's problem, predict where they need to be. So kind of on that flight plan, having been there before, and the Airiam team having been through many of these, to guide them. What's up around the next curve? What can they expect? For example, they maybe on an initial phone call with them, they may not be thinking forwards to storage requirements. So for example, that they may need additional storage if they're going to be going into decryption procedures, if it's a ransomware type of incident, to kind of give them that heads up. We've been here before. Here's something that you might want to be thinking about. Another thing that comes to mind in terms of collaboration is the touch points and connectivity, but not only with the client, but just between our teams. So we're really functioning as one team, which is a great thing about working Art with you and your team. Getting and staying organized, having that asset tracker to be able to take a look at what are the client's most pressing systems that need to be recovered, and then being able to track those, and leveraging the MOXFIVE platform increasingly to show that view, so that the client can visualize the environment coming back to life, and they can see that really tangibly. So having that repeatable framework for execution has been really helpful for us together, I think, over the years.
Yeah, and to just mention, Jim mentioned that MOXFIVE platform. Those of you who haven't experienced an incident, that platform is a make or break. It's just adding so much visibility to the incident and helps us manage that incident so much better than we ever have before. So those of you who have been through incidents, you understand that there's a level of chaos. There's a level of, it's hard to keep everything organized, and that MOXFIVE platform really helps us do that. So that's one of the definite key values that MOXFIVE is bringing also with these incidents, is keeping that flight plan together in a way that everybody can see it and collaborate in one platform together.
Yeah, and just we got analogies coming everywhere. Another analogy, aviation, you have a logbook, you have the tracking, you have the records, and that helps know where you stand in terms of the maintenance requirements for a plane, and know what to predict next. So having that similar, in the analogy sense, similar tracking and status and stuff lets everyone on an incident know where they stand and be able to track the progress and everything like that. So definitely a lot of parallels.
And if it's really important, one thing to that point, if it's something that is critical, so like checking engine functions before takeoff, that's really important to do while you're on the ground. The analogy back over on the IT recovery side would be your most critical systems as a business. Are you tracking those, and do you have those on formally on the radar, and in a way that all the different teams that are working on that response can action and move towards that goal.
Nice. So diving into it, the central theme, the flight plan for, we can say, ransomware prevention and ransomware recovery. So Jim, do you have a couple tips, a couple points for our listeners about what they can do to lessen the impact of ransomware, prevent ransomware in the first place?
Sure. So I think about it in terms of the prevention. Let's try not to get there. Let's avoid the scenario, minimize that risk that we know is out there. Then the response. So if something goes bump, how can you spring into action very quickly and maximize chances for a good outcome, minimize disruption to the business? And then resilience ties into prevention, but what can you do coming out of an incident? And so on the prevention side, when I think about analogies to an aviation, let's make sure the engine is functioning. Let's make sure that the wings are bolted on securely. The absolute must-haves that you should be doing out there. Things like implementing, making sure that you have endpoint detection and response, modern endpoint detection and response that has both detection and blocking capabilities deployed everywhere. Having multi-factor authentication, so that second plus factor of authentication to protect all of your internet-facing systems and email. backup resilience. So making sure that not only do you have backups and you're following redundancy there, but that you've specifically war gamed. If somebody was in my network maliciously, would they be able to get to my backups? As we see so often that a threat actor that's utilizing ransomware for extortion will do that. Those are just a few of those key prevention things.
Yeah, and I guess not assuming it's done right, but testing it. Kind of what you said. You're going through the plan, and you're opening up the books, opening up the different things that are needed before it happens. So that's key. Anything else on the prevention side, Art, that comes to mind?
The one thing that I'd say is that a lot of people have an IR plan now because they're required to for some compliance or for some insurance function, but they've never practiced it. And running through a real tabletop exercise and actually dedicating, a 4-hour block or a day-long block with your teams and bringing in your IT teams and your MSSP and your all your stakeholders that are involved in the organization, your IT team internally, your compliance officer, general counsel, etc., and run through it and really kind of identify where you're going to fall down. Sometimes you'll write the plan and it'll look pretty, or you'll grab some template online, and when you actually go to implement it, it's completely impossible to use, and it doesn't have the helpful things that you need in it, and you really haven't thought about a lot of the things that you're going to run into in an incident. And if you have all those stakeholders at the table and you're running through a tabletop, you may say something and then your MSSP may be like, no, that's not possible. Or your MSP may say, oh, we can't do that. Or the general counsel may say, we shouldn't do it this way. So having everybody involved on a big tabletop is something that is extremely valuable that most companies don't do. And I think as far as prevention, stepping through it and methodically and actually running through the plan with a scenario is one of the most useful things. It's not going to completely replace the amount of panic and stress that you're going to feel when it actually happens, but it's going to, at least you've seen it, at least you've experienced it in a scenario at least once. And doing that periodically makes things a little bit more practiced, so that when it does happen, at least like a fire drill, you know how to line up and stand by the teacher. Having those plans practiced is really important.
Nice. Good stuff. So for the flight plan, we got prevention and then the response. So preparing for when something happens and after something does happen. What are some recommendations, Jim, and some tips on that element?
So I think Art hit one of the most important ones, which is to actually have that plan and test it out. The communication and coordination components of that, I see that's where really the rubber meets the road in that moment, where, like Art said, plan may look good on paper, but say that you have multiple lines of business that have some local control over their different IT environments, and you have maybe scarce resources related to the recovery. What's going to be the process to make decisions? Even though you may have a defined corporate hierarchy where it makes sense to many of the key stakeholders, how is that going to flow down within the incident? The communication paths and decision-making process. And then another kind of more tactical thing, thinking about what you have documented in terms of even down to work instructions. And it could be with a triage process that may be executed by your own team. You may have third-party service providers where I would encourage you to still, you're working in partnership with them, but to make sure that you have an understanding together, and back to Garth's point again, go through the exercise of how are we going to, if an anomaly is identified, how are we going to get the facts? How are things going to be communicated to make sure that nothing is missed? So a lot of organizations are increasingly partnering for that expertise, those technical skills from outside service providers, and to be able to make sure that you have an understanding of who is going to be doing what and what are the roles and responsibilities, so that nothing is dropped when the scenario occurs.
Yeah, and talking about the collaboration, and again, the analogy, if maintenance on an airplane, there's not this one person, one small group can't do everything. you rely on specialists in different areas, and you trusted partners to accomplish the flight plan and the mission and stuff like that. And there's the communication, like we mentioned. So definitely a lot of parallels there. So prevention, the response, and then can you talk a little about the resilience part of it, or the full flight plan? How do things come to a conclusion in order to make sure the risk of ransomware, the risk of cyber incident is lessened in the future for the impacted organizations?
So to start it off, the way I look at it, and it's building on some of those concepts that I outlined and that Art built on when we talked about prevention, is making sure that the most important pieces are in place first. Oftentimes, especially in larger size, the larger the size of the organization, the environments are more complex and they'll have more tools, more technologies, but oftentimes still haven't addressed those basics. So I think in my experience, it's very important to make sure that you really have those basics in place before you move on and focus in other areas. But as you build out your program, building onto other areas of both process and technology in terms of privilege reductions, thinking about the root causes of many types of incidents. It may sound cliche, but defense in depth. So looking at the news recently related to the attacks by CLOP, and there will always be some zero-day vulnerability out there. There'll always be something that you don't know about. You can't depend on perfect knowledge of that. So running through the thought experiment of what would happen if XYZ application were to be taken over, or what if there was a zero-day vulnerability we don't know about that is present in some external facing product, and then how can we make sure that is just a relatively minor incident that can be contained rather than turning into something bigger.
So that redundancy, defense in depth, kind of like the redundancy, having backups, in a different sense of the word backups, but having multiple tools to potentially stop a threat actor.
If you think about like an onion, that's what defense in depth is usually compared to the layers of an onion. I think about defense in depth as you're actually planning for those layers to fail. You're expecting the attacker or the threat actor, depending on what avenue they're coming through, to beat some kind of control you have. So you need to have layered controls in place to be able to stop that. But I think from a resilience aspect, one of the things that comes after an incident that really is a growth point in resilience for companies is the adaptation that comes, is that identifying what happened and how we can adapt to that kind of attack in the future, and what we need to change in that post-remediation activity, the post-incident remediation and those activities in order to improve where you are, that adaptation that your company goes through. You're going to get hacked. That just happens. Most companies are experiencing kind of constant cyber pressure right now. And, so the chances of an attack being successful is pretty high. And, so our key for resilience is being able to bounce back quickly by constantly adapting to attacks. If you just recover to where you were after an attack, you're never improving, and you're going to be in the same place for the next attacker. So you need to constantly be evolving and adapting your situation to be more resilient.
And Art, I would build on that. If that's definitely true. I've seen that same thing after you've experienced an attack. If find yourself in a fortunate situation, if you have not experienced one of these destructive attacks, I would encourage you to take advantage of the blog post, the knowledge that's out there on what happens. Engage experts that have been through this before and walk you through those scenarios so you can get a good idea both from a process perspective as well as even combining it in with red team, purple team type exercises that can actually test your technical controls so that you can get an understanding of what you're up against and test, even though you haven't been through it, to get a similar experience to having gone through it.
Nice. Some great tips from the flight plan for ransomware prevention and recovery. Any final advice, Jim or Art, on the flight plan? Anything else to add to the plan before we sign off?
I would say most important is to get started on it today is really my advice. If it's something that you've been fortunate that you haven't experienced personally or within your current organization, take those small steps, ask the questions, ask what would happen when you're going through your day-to-day. What if this system were to be compromised? What if, what if? It's kind of back to the processes we go through when flying. What am I going to do if the engine fails? What do I do if there's a thunderstorm that's not kind of where I thought it was? And that's really the only the paranoid survive kind of mentality that will really help you in this industry.
Yes, only the paranoid survive is the perfect analogy to it. And I think that as companies are trying to think of what do we need to do as our next step coming out of listening to this, it's I'd call MOXFIVE and ask for a tabletop scenario just to run through something so that you understand where you are. And that I think that is probably a good step to get you on the flight plan.
Nice, great stuff. So, Jim, when's your next flight? You got any flights coming up? Do you do it like weekly or monthly, or you
try to do it monthly to every other month. Weather's been a bit challenging lately, so we'll see. Hopefully Sunday.
Oh, all right. Look for Jim flying above you in the Northeast area. So
nice.
That's great stuff. All right. Well, I want to thank Jim and Art again for joining us on the episode. I encourage any listeners who found some good tips on their flight plan for ransomware recovery to subscribe to the podcast and whatever platform you're listening in. New episodes will typically come out every other Wednesday. For more information on MOXFIVE and to find out how you can get set up with that tabletop exercise that we do recommend, you can visit MOXFIVE.com. For more information on Airiam, you can visit Airiam.com. So thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you.